Okay, hello everyone, welcome, welcome, welcome. I am Wendy Wasserman and I am the Community Sales Manager here at Politics and Prose, and welcome to PNP Live tonight. We're super excited to have you. We're super excited to have Dorothy on her publication day, which is kind of amazing. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. That was my fault. We were having some tech issues on my side. So let's just get rolling right here with Dorothy. We are delighted to welcome Dorothy with her new book, Torn Apart. Dorothy is an acclaimed scholar of race and gender in the law and is the George Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. The author of 4 previous books, including Killing the Black Body. She lives in Philadelphia, where she's joining us from now. And her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent social justice issues in policing, family regulation, science, medicine, and bioethics. And she's been featured in the countless media outlets, including the New York Times, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, Vice News, CNN, ABC, and many others. And Dorothy will be in conversation with Keeanga-Yahmatta Taylor, author of Race for Profit, How Banks in the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership, published in 2019 by the University of North Carolina Press. Race for Profit was a semi-finalist for the 2019 National Book Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2020. She is a 2021 MacArthur Foundation Fellow, otherwise known as a genius, and is professor of the African American Studies at Princeton. And she is currently a contributing writer to The New Yorker, along with other outlets. Ladies, take it away.
Great. Hello, Dorothy. Very nice to see you. Congratulations on your publication day.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you too. And thanks for agreeing to do this. I'm just so excited about it.
Well, let's get started. And let me just say that I hope everyone gets this book. Like me, you know, and I consider myself a pretty well-read person. I know a lot about the criminal justice system, know a lot about prisons and mass incarceration. And then I came to find out that I knew absolutely nothing about the child welfare system and the really disturbing ways that it overlaps with the criminal justice system. And I have to say that this book, it was both it was both a page turner, you know, like I sit down and read, you know, 7,500 pages. Mm-hmm. And I also found it incredibly difficult to read.
Yeah.
I texted a mutual friend of ours today, Ruha Benjamin, and said that every time I look at this book, I want to, you know, throttle someone. And so, you know, I want to just start by asking you, and I feel like I figured it out over the course of reading the book, but for our audience and, you know, for people who are wondering what this book is about and why this book now, Can you talk about what are some of the issues that motivated you to write a book such as this right now?
Well, I have been working on this topic for more than 20 years, and I wrote a book on the topic 20 years ago, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. And so I had to think very deliberately about, do I want to write a new book now instead of maybe updating the old one? And I felt it was urgent to write a new book that took a stronger abolitionist stand and set out the harms of this system and the way in which it is a policing system, its connection to the criminal punishment system. And that's partly because of abolitionist organizing around the prison industrial complex. That's been much more present in our politics today, even though its roots go back a long way. But I think the US public is more aware of it. The protests that occurred in the wake of the George Floyd murder by police and other killings as well, brought to the forefront a way of thinking of abolishing these systems and replacing them with forms of care that truly prevent violence and that truly keep people safe and truly meet human needs and address conflicts. But missing from that was the child welfare system. And in fact, I was pretty alarmed when I heard some prison abolitionists and those calling for defunding the police to take those funds and put them into human services departments that run child protection. It was clear to me that people, even those who were very active in the prison abolition movement and other social justice movements, just weren't aware of what this system does to Black families, how destructive it is, and also its connections to criminal law enforcement and other forms of carceral policing. And so it seemed very urgent to get this message out in conjunction with, and I should also mention that at the same time, another major development that makes this urgent is there's a growing movement of activists, especially parents and other family caregivers who have been involved in this system, entangled in it, whose kids have been taken away from them, are increasingly organizing for abolition. And so I wanted to write a book that would be useful to that movement and help to fuel it, help to give them the documentation that they needed and the thinking around it, calling for people who are dedicated to human rights and social justice, to ending white supremacy and racial capitalism, to understand that we need to integrate into our organizing and our research and our thinking this system that I call a family policing system that has the same carceral logics. It surveils and disrupts the same Black communities, and it operates in just an amazingly similar way, and also literally arm in arm with police officers, because they often accompany.
They show up together.
They show up together for investigations. And as I point out in the book, that entanglement of police officers and caseworkers makes both of those carceral systems stronger, because the caseworkers can intimidate families more if there's an armed police officer coming into the home, or several of them, which often happens as well. And then the police get a pass from having to at least pretend they're trying to apply constitutional restraints on them, because when they go along with caseworkers, there's this idea that, oh, there's an exception for them because they're going in to protect families. This propaganda about protecting families has really fooled people into thinking this is some benevolent system when it's actually a policing system.
So you refer to this system as benevolent terror.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so I will just say that one of the things that I found to be shocking was the degree to which the state is involved in removing Black children from their homes.
Mhm.
And so, you know, you mentioned this in the book that the language, it's almost Orwellian, right? That it's a child welfare system, it's child protective services.
Mhm.
And yet, I think any body of research shows that the removal of children from their primary caregivers is a traumatizing event and should really be the absolute last resort that any rational system comes to. But in the case of Black families, and we're, you know, really talking about disproportionately poor and working class
Yeah.
Black families, it seems like, if not the first impulse, that it is part of the first kind of things to reach for in the toolbox with Black families. So I'm wondering if you could talk some about what child protective services, the child welfare system is actually doing in Black families. I mean, the stories that you use to kind of illustrate. So it's not you're just, you know, exhorting us with a bunch of facts about what is happening, but you're using the stories of Black families to really illustrate the terror that is enacted in Black families and Black communities, really. So talk to us about why these state institutions are snatching Black children out of their families.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you talk about the toolbox, there aren't many tools in the toolbox. And
Right.
that's part of the problem here, is that because the state is not providing true support, the kinds of supports that families need. You know, we don't have universal health care in America. We don't have guaranteed affordable housing. We don't have high quality education for everybody, you know, and I could go on and on. And so the only thing in many cases that caseworkers can so-called offer, to be Orwellian again, it's actually forced upon them when there's a situation where children are in need. They need decent housing, you know, they need food and clothing, they need shelter, they need help with mental health issues. And all that there is to offer in that toolbox is taking children away. And even if they're not immediately taken away, the whole system still relies on this threat of child removal. That is the basis of the so-called child welfare system in America, is we will take your children or we will threaten to take them, and you must comply with our directives in order to get them back. And those directives have this this Orwellian title of services, but they're forced on families and they rarely actually meet the needs of children in those families. And so this is the primary service in terms of the amount of money that's spent on child welfare, you know, in the child welfare system, is by far 10 times more money is spent on foster care. And there's a racist, white supremacist essential aspect to this, because it was only when Black people demanded inclusion in the New Deal benefit programs during the civil rights movement. They'd been excluded. You know, there were hardly any Black people in the South who were receiving benefits, welfare benefits, in the 1950s, until the civil rights movement demanded, and freedom struggles, right, demanded that Black people get their fair share of benefits that white people were getting. But as soon as that happened, both as a retaliation, a white backlash against welfare benefits going to Black mothers, but also a way of pivoting the policy away from giving benefits to children in their homes to removing them. And we can see very clear historical confluence of Black children entering the system and a pivot, just astronomical rise in foster care placement, along with the budget for that, compared to prior years where most money was spent on services to intact families when they were white families. So we have to look at the neoliberal increasing reliance on the market, which is also going on, in the 80s and 90s, and looking to getting children adopted out of foster care instead of reuniting them. Same in conjunction with the abolition of the federal entitlement to welfare restructuring, in connection with the crime control bill and the more intense intrusion of police officers in Black communities. All of this is going on at the same time. And so, although it's true that the child welfare system has its roots in enslavement of Black people, in the apprenticeship of Black children, in the removal of Indigenous children as a weapon of war, in more recent times, it has taking up those same designs of oppressing marginalized communities, the most disenfranchised communities. In recent times, we can also see it as part of the neoliberal shift to market-based solutions and the end of welfare, the entitlement to welfare, and the buildup of mass incarceration. All of this happens simultaneously. And the child welfare system is an integral part of that. You cannot separate it from any of those. It's absolutely entangled with both the historical trajectory and the carceral logics of welfare and crime control and the war on drugs and the hyper incarceration of Black people.
Well, let me ask you about the kind of overlap with prisons and the carceral network and child welfare, because at this pivotal moment, the kind of turn to punishment at the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s, Christian Parenti and others have written about the ways that the turn to punishment in prisons was a way to deal with social dynamite and superfluous Black populations that had been at the heart of the Black rebellions in the 1960s. And these were people who were envisioned as populating prisons to remove them essentially from society. And so I'm wondering how you see a punitive social welfare system, child welfare system, that moves from probably a still an oppressive framework, even for poor white children, but that at least did not envision removing wholesale white children from their families. So you document the shift in policy and practice when Black children have won the right to child welfare services during this time. And so what politically, if we see prisons as a way to deal with superfluous Black populations in the 1960s and 70s, what is the larger context do you see for the removal, this punitive child welfare system that is removing Black children from their homes?
Well, it's a similar form of disruption of communities and removal of children from their communities, or even if they remain in their communities because the foster caretakers are Black. In many communities, they're increasingly kinship caretakers,
Mm.
there still is the supervision of these families by the state
By the
through
state.
Child
Yeah.
Protective Services, and the constant threat that children can be taken away from those kin caregivers if they don't meet the mandates of the state as well. So it is like prisons, it's a form of removing children from maybe, it could be from their entire communities. I mean, some children are shipped out of state to residential treatment centers. It could be within the community, but separated from their families, which is a major form of trauma and disruption. So that's one, it's the infliction of trauma and terror on families that's extremely disruptive in the way that prisons are as well. But then there's also the particular way that Child Protective Services, because it has this benevolent facade, it doesn't seem like a punitive system like prisons. And so it allows the government in some ways to be even more intrusive in people's lives without public scrutiny and without courts bothering to protect the rights of the families who are being intervened upon and their children taken from them. And this serves a particular pretense that we have a society that is taking care of children, and therefore we don't need radical change to provide the kinds of resources and the kinds of structures that would actually support children. So people know that prisons are punitive, and there are false kinds of justifications for them as well. But if you believe that the system is protecting children, then it becomes an even better kind of justification for disrupting communities that even than prisons are. And so it's similar to prisons in that it has this carceral logic of punishment and surveillance and disruption as a way of meeting human needs, like prisons do. In some ways, this is even clearer. They literally are saying they're meeting the needs of children by taking them from their homes. So it's like prisons in that way, but in some ways, it's got this benevolent facade. So it allows the state to inflict this harm on Black communities without even having to bother to go through criminal procedure, without even having to bother to convict people of crimes. They can have their children taken from them and years on end of surveillance without ever being charged with a crime or ever having the protections of the Fourth Amendment, which should apply. The Fourth Amendment applies to these government searches by child protective agents of people's homes, but it's rarely applied because of this kind of amorphous exception that's not really written in law for protecting children. And also, importantly, because families are intimidated. So when you have a caseworker show up with a police officer very often, and they say, let us in your home because someone has reported you for child neglect. And if you don't, we'll think that something really is going on in your home. And so many people let them in to prove that they're not doing anything harmful to their children, or they think they're going to get help, or they're just scared. They're just scared. And
it's why people allow the police to search them, even though they don't have the legal right to do so.
Exactly. And so now you've got this dual threat of not only is there the police officer there you're already afraid of, but you've got a caseworker there saying, I have the power to take your children away from you. For many people, that's even more frightening.
Absolutely.
And they know that this can happen because this agency involvement is concentrated in segregated Black neighborhoods with high rates of poverty, and everybody in the neighborhood knows the power of these agents that come into the neighborhood. Yeah.
So let me ask you, because I think that a lot of this, and you write extensively about this in the book, stems, the particular treatment of Black families stems from this idea that Black families are domestically dysfunctional.
Absolutely.
And so what I want to ask is, if we think about the work of Khalil Muhammad and his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, it really, I think, is one of the best explanations for where the stereotype of Black crime or the Black criminal came from. The kind of manipulation of statistics by both the social scientists and becomes ingrained in the mass media and popular culture and becomes a kind of common sense. And so where do you think this myth of the dysfunctional Black family, in particular, the kind of wayward and irresponsible Black mother, unruly, unmanageable Black children, and thus, to the absent father, or violent or, drug addicted, drunk father, where does this image that seems to, where does it begin? It hasn't ended. Where does this image of the Black family that then becomes the rationalization for the intrusion of the state into Black homes, where does this come from?
Yeah, well, its origins are in the slavery system and the way in which Black parents had no legal authority over their children. During enslavement of Black people, the white plantation owner was the patriarch of the whole plantation family, which included human beings that he owned. And so in chattel slavery, with the idea that Black people were property that could be completely controlled by enslavers, that included the right of the enslaver to raise the children and have authority over them, including the authority to sell them off to anyone that they pleased, apart from the parents. The disruption of the family was one of the most horrific aspects of enslavement. And during the abolition movement, of the slavery abolition movement, and the arguments before Congress for passing the Reconstruction Amendments, and in narratives of Black people and their actions, they saw family separation as one of the key evils of slavery that needed to be abolished. And so we can look back to that original treatment of Black families, Black family caregivers, as not having any authority over their children, needing supervision of white people, and the disruption of the family not being a harm to children. I talk about in my book watching what was the movie? Was it 19 Years a Slave? How many years a slave was it? Okay,
yes,
you know what movie I'm talking about. Okay, major motion picture. 12 Years a Slave. Somebody.
Solomon Northup.
Thank you. Exactly. So there's a scene in it where some children of an enslaved mother have been sold to another enslaver, and the new owner comes in to take the children, and of course the mother is screaming, "Don't take my children!" The children are crying, and the white wife of the original enslaver, says, "Oh, don't worry, she'll get over it quickly." And this was this idea. You see it in lots and lots of writings by enslavers that Black parents would get over the loss of their children very easily. Of course, this was a common stereotype about Black people. Thomas Jefferson wrote about this as well, that, we don't have deep emotions. We can be easily distracted. We're unreasonable, but we also don't have loving connections with family members. And so this idea that there isn't a true bond between Black family members that needs to be valued, I think is deeply embedded today and is a big part of the kind of thinking around why it is demonstrated to be easier to take a Black child from the home than a white child from the home based on the exact same evidence of harm. Studies have found that caseworkers are more likely to take the Black child, in addition to studies that show that reporters, especially doctors, are more likely to perceive the same injuries to children as abuse if it happens to Black children than if it happens to white children. So that's the origin of it. But then during the Reconstruction era and the backlash against the emancipation of Black people by the white supremacists, who dominated the South, there was the apprenticeship system where enslavers could go to court and claim that Black children were being neglected. Now, these are newly freed Black children, and courts would rule that they had to return to their former enslavers to work for them as apprentices. This was going on at the same time as the convict leasing system, the same Black codes that provided for convict leasing or that allowed for the criminalization of Black everyday life also included these provisions that allowed for forced apprenticeship of Black children. So that's another connection to the prison system. But I want to emphasize, though, as well, the stereotypes about Black mothers that also stem from the slavery era, the idea of the Black Jezebel that was completely promiscuous and lascivious, that tempted white men, as an excuse for sexual assault of Black women, that supports the idea that Black women are hypersexual, have too many children. And then, I could go through a litany of them. Some of them are very familiar. The Black crack addict who was supposed to trade sex for crack and smoke crack while pregnant because she didn't care about her child, and then produce the so-called crack baby. All of this a complete myth. And then the Black welfare queen who was supposed to have babies just to get a welfare check and didn't spend it on her children, but spent it on herself. All of these images of Black mothers who are selfish, who don't know how to care for children, and who don't really care for their children. These are very prominent images. And again, they help to fuel mass incarceration. They help to fuel the bipartisan support for ending the federal entitlement to welfare. And they also help to fuel, in one integrated web, the support for a child welfare system that disproportionately takes Black children away from their families, often without account for the harm that it's doing to those children. There is this assumption, and again, this is borne out in studies that have found this, and I can attest, I've been working in this field for 25 years. I have heard these things said in my presence, an assumption that these children are better off anywhere else but with their families. And so despite all the evidence that Black children get the worst services and their families, they get the worst services, the most inadequate services, they get the most punitive so-called services, but also they have the worst outcomes. They're more likely to be placed in these prison-like residential therapeutic centers, as they call them. They're more likely to age out of foster care and be left as an 18-year-old or 20-year-old without the resources and mentorship that they need to succeed. They're less likely to go to college. They're more likely to enter juvenile detention. They're more likely to be incarcerated. They're more likely to be homeless. They're more likely to be impoverished, coming out of foster care. And we know all this. This is so well documented, and yet that's not enough for people to want to end this, because of this idea that, well, it must be doing some good for these children, right? It's got to be better than their homes. And also the idea that they come from dysfunctional families. And so that's the reason why they have these poor outcomes. It's not because of the system. One of the arguments I make in my book, and I think it's well documented, that foster care itself is structured to harm children. And that's why we see these negative outcomes for children who, as now adults coming out of the system, very young adults are, and even while they're in foster care, are entering juvenile detention and higher rates of houselessness, running away from foster care and living in the streets. It's really atrocious treatment of these children. And I think a lot of the reason why there isn't more public scrutiny of it is this assumption of Black family dysfunction. Yes. that causes people to think, well, yeah, this is bad, but it would have been worse if they were left at home.
In Pennsylvania, we're both in Philadelphia. There's been this big lawsuit around how schools in the state are funded. And one of the ways that Republicans have defended the structure of funding was to essentially say that in these school districts where Black children are in schools that receive less funding, that they don't really care about education in the first place. And so, the underlying logic being, why spend money? And so you see this this logic or this idea about Black children, Black mothers, Black families as not caring, irresponsible. You see the kind of range of ways that the logic of that radiates out and becomes an excuse for not investing in public services, in certain social services, and then over investing in others. So in the punitive aspects.
Yes, this is I call it I almost said prison industrial complex. It's like the prison industrial complex. It's a foster industrial
Absolutely.
complex.
Yeah.
So many people are making money off of child removal and maintaining children away from their homes. Many states engage private companies to manage their foster care system, and these companies make money. They only make money if there are more foster children coming into their so-called services. And there's also an incentive then to keep the children in there and not return them home, and also not to pay close attention to the harms that are happening to these children, because they're receiving federal and state and local funds to run these systems. So that's one part of it. Also, if you combine all the federal money that goes into, most of it is spent on foster care and removing children, maintaining them outside of their homes. You add that up with the state and local funds, it's upwards of $30 billion a year. This is not a small social service program. It's a major apparatus that spends most of its money on family separation. And then in addition to that, just to add insult to injury or injury to injury, many of these local child welfare departments then become the financial representatives of the children in foster care. And they take the Social Security benefits,
They steal it.
the survivor benefits, disability benefits from the children. And the state claims, well, we're using it as reimbursement for what we spent on the children. Well, first of all, you have an obligation to care for these children. You took them from their family caregivers. You have an obligation to take care of them. They shouldn't have to reimburse you for it. And so that's number one. And number two, it's not as if these child welfare departments are taking the money and putting them in an account and spending it on the children who were entitled to those benefits. It goes into the state budget.
The general fund.
General funds. And I write about in the book, based largely on work of Daniel Hatcher, and also the Marshall Project has looked into this as well, even more recently than Daniel Hatcher's book, that you can see through email correspondence how with these big consulting firms that they hire to find children who are entitled to these benefits and increase their numbers in foster care. And so then there is clear evidence that that sometimes states see they're going to have a budget shortfall and they figure out how to fill it by taking money, stealing money from these children. They're not spending it on them. There are now accounts that children who have aged out with nothing at all, when they could have had these funds saved for them. So at least they'd have some kind of safety net when they age out of foster care, instead of having to fend for themselves, not without the financial resources. And often their family ties have been permanently severed by the state, and they've been separated. They've lost touch with their family. Now, on the other hand, there are many children who age out, and the way they survive is to go back to their families that they were separated from. And so you just have to ask yourself, why wasn't all that money spent on keeping the family together, providing for whatever the needs the children had and the family had, whatever the problems were in the family, dealing with those instead of taking the children, keeping them in foster care, having them age out with nothing, often, again, without any prospects of going to college, without the skills they need for a job, and no adults to rely on. Anyone who is a parent in this audience with a child who is 18 years old or 20 years old or 21, I have a 21-year-old, I can tell you he could not possibly survive without my constant support. And the idea that children can be left like this after the trauma of taking from their families. I think it's very telling that often when children run away from foster care, they search for their families to go back to. And if they can't, some of them would rather live in the street than go back to foster care. Runaways is a big problem. And it's very telling, I think, that children would rather run away than stay in state care, so-called care. Another telling aspect of the foster care system is how it sometimes follows families generation after generation. And the children who were raised in foster care are now seen as unfit parents for their children. And that just continues over several generations. If the state is such a good caregiver, better than the family, they should not be having to take children away from the generation that they raised. And that's just one other indication of how this is not a system that protects children, it polices families, and we can replace it with truly caring and supportive ways of both providing for children's needs, but also dealing with domestic violence instead of addressing it after it occurs and by taking children away from their families. So there's better ways to do it. And that's what I'm calling for in my book.
I could talk to you all night about this, and we'd have people who raise questions, who want to ask questions, be very disappointed. So instead of me abusing my role as a facilitator, let me shift to some of the questions, and we'll, answer them in whatever way you will. And we've got about 15 minutes left.
Okay.
So, okay. So the first question is, I'm interested in learning more about your ideological journey from when you first started writing Shattered Bonds to now with Torn Apart. In Shattered Bonds, there was more of a focus on reform. And now it seems, yes, that you have turned to abolition. Yes. Can you share more about how your personal views have changed between the publications of these two books? That's a fantastic question.
Yes, I'd love to. So I wrote, or at least Shattered Bonds was published 21 years ago. And I did think about writing a new preface for it and just a new edition. And it was clear to me that my thinking had changed a lot, and even more than the system has stayed basically the same. I think what changed the most for me is that I did engage in a set of reform efforts over those 20 years. By the way, I do want to mention that I did say in Shattered Bonds that the system should be abolished. So I took that position there. But I think the person who asked the question is absolutely right. I can even remember very vividly having to write the last chapter and thinking, I've got to come up with some solutions to this, and thinking about reforms, but even then feeling like this isn't enough. This is not going to really solve the problem. And I have talked to lots and lots of social work groups and, so training of social workers to try to get them to be less biased. I've, worked with policymakers where the idea was, how can we shrink the disparities, but keep the system the same, right? Just shrink the disparities between Black and white children. And also, I worked for 9 years on an expert panel that came out of a class action lawsuit that found that the state of Washington was violating the constitutional rights of children in foster care. And I and 4 other experts, we put together this big plan, and with all these action steps and all these things that the child welfare system was supposed to do. And maybe some things were tweaked a little bit, but it's basically the same system harming children the same way. So part of my evolution was trying reform efforts and finding that they were completely inadequate. Another major part was my becoming familiar with and working with prison abolitionists and understanding that way of thinking about how to radically change our society by dismantling the white supremacist, racist, classist, sexist, patriarchal systems we have now that are not meeting people's needs, and in fact are doing the opposite, are punishing the very people who are most disadvantaged by structural inequities in our society. And that is exactly what the child welfare system does. And so the principles from abolishing the prison industrial complex and the thinking that's gone into that, the strategizing that I could then learn from, helped me to shape an abolitionist approach to family policing. Also becoming more aware of the deep entanglements, both in terms of the carceral logic, but also the material entanglements of police officers and caseworkers and police departments and child welfare departments. That was a big part of it as well. And then finally, what what shaped maybe the most was continuing to work with activists, and these are mostly parent activists, parents who have been, and mostly Black mothers, whose children have been taken from them, who have come to realize the harms of this system and have increasingly been coming together to abolish it and to replace it with a more caring, humane way, an effective way of addressing safety in families and the needs of families. So all of that happened over the last 20 years and brought me to want to write a new book, Torn Apart, that incorporates all of that thinking and knowledge and activism that I was fortunate to engage in over those decades.
So these next two questions are really, I think, where you end kind of leads into them. So the first one, I'm going to read these two together because they overlap. What are some concrete actions that can be taken to begin the long haul work of dismantling the family regulation system? Who needs to be involved? And can you speak a little to intergenerational involvement with family policing and what you think we can do to combat that as we work towards abolition? And so this, I think, talking about what is it that you've referenced this in your comments, and you spend a good deal about this in the book, that, it's not just abstract activists from somewhere, but these are people who are directly involved, impacted, families who have taken the lead in organizing. So if you could talk some about that.
Yeah, that's right. And so part of my answer to the question is get to know these organizers and what they're doing and join in. So I'll mention a few of them. There's Joyce McMillan. I write extensively about her in Torn Apart. She had the experience of having her baby taken from her when an anonymous caller reported her for using drugs. It took her a couple of years to get her daughter back, and she became an activist, a very fierce activist against the Administration for Children's Services in New York City. And she has a strategy, she has a plan. In fact, she's got a network that are working on a package of legislation. And this is, part of the incremental steps to dismantling the system piece by piece by, for example, giving family caregivers really high quality family defense. And this is also, I think, an abolitionist move, which is the creation of family defense practices that are multidisciplinary. They include social workers and they include parent peer advocates, most of whom have had these experiences with the family policing system themselves. And their aim is to keep families from being separated. And if they are unsuccessful, to get families reunited as soon as possible. I mentioned that the Fourth Amendment is routinely not applied to support the legislation that would actually enforce constitutional protections. Now, that's not the full scope of abolition, but it's a step, it's part of an incremental step toward it. And I think it's important to keep in mind Ruth Wilson Gilmore's principle of non-reformist reform. Sometimes we have to engage in what might be called a reform to give parents and family caregivers legal rights and enforce them in the move toward abolition of the system, to reduce the suffering of people in this system now. But the point is that it's moving toward the abolitionist horizon. It's not building up the system, it's shrinking it. And just as importantly is to simultaneously be building up a replacement for it. Mutual aid networks and prison abolitionists have been involved in creating mutual aid networks in communities around the country, transformative justice processes that are being developed largely by anti-carceral Black feminists, many of whom are themselves survivors of violence, including child abuse, child sexual abuse, but know that simply taking children away or putting adults in prison is not the answer. It hasn't worked to prevent domestic violence. And in fact, the child welfare system promotes it because many people are afraid to get help because they're afraid their children are going to be taken from them. And so all of these kinds of both dismantling and also building up a replacement, we already know many of the things we can do because Black people have been engaging in community-based support for each other's children, for centuries, actually. And there's examples of the Black Panther Party, for example, providing free breakfasts and free healthcare to children in Black communities. There's kinship networks apart from the child welfare system, and that could include aunties and grandmas and family friends who come in, and this is common that sometimes they're not even a member by ancestry in the family, but they're such a close friend. You call them Aunt so and so, right? And you know that you've got that refuge if necessary to help with the family. I'm talking about just a broad range of kinds of policies. I also include policies like guaranteed income to families. We know so much of this. We know that the best way to improve children's welfare is to guarantee an income to their family caregivers. And we also know, and we have recent examples of this during the COVID pandemic, during the lockdown, where the Biden administration was giving out checks, no strings attached, income supplements, that reduced poverty. And we also know it's predicted now that when they end, millions of children are going to go back into poverty as a result of not having the income they need. So I support universal policies like that provide the material needs, including income, healthcare, housing, that people need. If we did everything I just mentioned,
right,
we would keep children far more safer. We would improve their welfare far more than what we have now. And what we have now is an impediment to building up these mutual aid and care kinds of resources in communities, and an impediment to having the kinds of policies that would truly protect children, keep them safe, and care for them and provide for their welfare. So I believe that we need to dismantle this system in order to have a kind of society that would truly care for children and support families. But we need to be working toward that, because you have to have a replacement. Children are in need now. Yeah, I'm not saying that they're not. There are children who are harmed in their homes. And so we need a replacement. We need to be building that so we have something else for these families, all of our families, and we don't have to rely on calling the child abuse hotline when we see a family in need. Let me just mention also, I want to shout out to Movement for Family Power in New York City that is helping with organizing efforts. And also the Upend movement is another that is taking an abolitionist stand. There are many others, family defense practices and legal services offices also. I could go on, but that's just a start for some of the people that are organizing now and that are strategizing about concrete ways we can begin dismantling the family policing system and right now begin replacing it with a far better way of supporting families and caring for children.
Professor Dorothy Roberts in her new book, Torn Apart. please get it. It's a fantastic book, I
Spectacular.
really have to say. It's really
It's
excellent.
spectacular, and she's
Thank
given us some really good marching orders and some amazing inspiration to move things forward. So thank you, Dorothy. Congratulations on Pub Day. Get the book hot off the press. Thank you, Keeanga-Yahmatta, for a great conversation. Thank you to the 75 of us who joined us this evening. And carry on, carry on. Thank you again, all.
Thanks for that conversation, Keeanga. Thank you so
That was
much.
great.
And thanks, Politics and Prose.
Our